I'd like to introduce you to our moderator of the growth panel. It's a name most of you should be familiar with, David Zeldowski. A little bit on David. David serves as the director of the Center for Irrigation Technology, California Water Institute at California State University, Fresno, where he had been actively working on water use efficiency issues for over 30 years. While at Fresno State, David was named Person of the Year by the California Irrigation Institute and received a similar award from the Irrigation Association in 2013. He was a senior fellow with the California Council on Science and Technology and an honorary member of the American Society of Irrigation Consultants. Please, everyone, join me in giving a round of applause for David Zeldowski.
I'm recently retired, so, well, just tired. I don't think so, yeah, welcome. This is very exciting. I've been at this actually about 35 years. And it was a natural progression. We had an irrigation testing lab that we developed with the industry back in 1980, 82 or so. And we had lots of technologies come in, lots of folks with ideas. And some of those never made it to market. And I always wondered, was it lack of capital? Was there some flaw in the technology that we didn't discover? And by adding the incubator and now the accelerator, we think we close that gap so that when we do have products and services that have great potential and value, that we've got a support system and infrastructure that will bring them to the market and let the market decide whether they're as good as we think they are. So with that, we have a distinguished panel today. I want to thank the gentlemen for showing up on the hottest day of the year. Probably the air conditioning is a good incentive to come see us. But I know Las Vegas and the travel west side and Kingsburg, is that right, John? Is that right?
Selma.
Selma, okay. Social climate, right?
Yeah.
These are three gentlemen that are very active in their farming operations and very knowledgeable on the water and other issues, but we're going to pick on the water technology piece today. And so I'm going to do a little short introduction of each of them so you get a little understanding of who and what they are. So I'm going to start with John Chandler. He works with Chandler Farm, which is a fourth generation farming operation, started in 1890. He's been around for a while. And they produce stone fruit, peaches, plums, nectarines, some almonds, citrus, grapes, raisins, and wine. And John's here today. Works as a consultant up in Sacramento, is that right? Yeah. Okay, as a consultant to the State Senate Committee on Agriculture. And his mother's been a great supporter of Fresno State as well, so we appreciate that. Hope she's doing well. And as a consultant, he negotiated amendments and pre-senators on ag policy issues. He's a Cal Poly graduate. He's got a bachelor's degree in fruit science. Is that correct? That's correct. Great. Thank you for that. And then we got Danny Royer with Bowles Farming Company. By the way, you have the greatest title of anybody I've ever seen in the ag. I just love it every time I get to say it. He's the VP of technology for Bowles Farming. So think about that commitment, right? A farming operation that has a position, a high position of VP for technology. I think that's terrific. And that just shows the evolution of farming in California and where we're at today. Couldn't imagine that 20 years ago. That's just amazing. So Bowles Farming Company is family owned and operated, located near Las Vegas. And the farm currently is being managed by sixth generation of Bowles and Lawrence family. And related to Miller Lutz, is that right?
Current CEO is Henry Miller's great-grandson.
Okay, so you've heard of Miller Lutz, they were kind of big farmers here a while ago. It's a good thing. So, and they are row crop farmers, is that right? Or annual crop farmers, and processing tomatoes, fresh tomatoes, melons, long staple cotton, alfalfa, and whatever else will pay the bills, right? Great. So Danny's also a Cal Poly graduate and an ag systems management. Has worked for Morningstar, Vista Livestock, and we welcome you here today. So thank you very much for traveling. I think you traveled for us today. And then Daniel Hartwick, right, with Wolf Farming, and probably see his boss occasionally, Stuart, running around. There's a lot here at the state. Appreciate that. Wolf Farming was founded by Jack Wolf back in 1974. And he worked for Giffen Farms before that, is that right? Yeah. So part of that legacy and those big operations in those days. So where they're farming almonds, processing tomatoes, pistachios, garlic, they continue to reinvest in the land, water infrastructure, and innovation that allows Wolves to continue to expand their operation today. 3 generations of the Wolf family are involved in farming, and processing operation, and you guys process tomatoes and almonds and probably other stuff too as well.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, so anyway, yeah, so they're into it, and we're glad to have our token Fresno State graduate here with Daniel, so we appreciate that. I'm also a Fresno State graduate, so I guess we're balanced out too. He got his MBA and his VP of Rural Relations with farmers. So thank you all for being here. And so we're going to pick your brain a little bit. I want to hear from you, kind of what you're seeing on the field and on the ground. And so I'm just going to ask the question. You can jump in. There's a mic there. Hopefully it's turned on and pass it around. But what new ag technologies are you currently using and why? So where is that sweet or hot spot that got you guys going right now? Related to water or anything? Well, water, energy, production, yeah, anything. It all integrates. I mean, remote sensing, all that stuff comes back into the farming. So yes.
So I'm getting to try a little bit of everything, whether it's sensing, the different types of telemetry, different types of sensors. I think the most important piece of what we're working on related to any type of information that we're collecting is we're really trying to spend time to think about all of this information. What do we do with it when it comes in? How do we store it? And how do we make it relative to existing workflows? And then if we need to change something because we have newer, better information, how do we adopt change or get change adoption? But the sensors themselves, there's a lot of different pieces out there. I think for irrigation specifically, we're still trying to figure out which sensor is the right sensor. Is it a sensor that goes on the plant? Is it a sensor that goes in the soil? Is it a sensor that goes in the air? Is it a combination of the three? And I think that what's driving a lot of those decisions for us right now is the scalability of those sensors. So the cost, getting the cost point down on both the communications and then the actual sensor itself is where we're really focused in terms of strategically looking at the different tools.
So Danny, before you leave that, so you mentioned the three areas of sensors. Are you leaning in any direction? Do you think you can do it with a single point, or do you feel more comfortable with all three, kind of telling you where you ought to be, and when they disagree, then you got something to look at?
So right now, for adoption's sake, we're looking at the sensors that our existing agronomist is using, which is just the cheap $40 tensiometers, watermarks, and we're actually looking at how do we create a communication system for those instead of having to go out and read them. So right now, that's what we're really focused on because that's something our agronomist is comfortable with, and they're cheap, so they're scalable. So it's getting the communications piece cheap and scalable as well. Okay, great.
We're on a very similar track to what Danny's talking about as well. We have a ton of different sensors, including I think Grow Guru's speaking later. So we're actually hooked up with them after one of the previous Valley Ventures speaking things we did. And so really for us on the west side, one of the big challenges is having to use groundwater when our water allocation is cut very significantly. So we're having to use groundwater. Groundwater quality is quite poor, and so we're trying to manage our salts and really try to see what impact those are having, that salt's having on our trees, as well as in our row crops as well. So we're using some technologies there. A lot of it comes down to, again, various sensors, soil sensors, plant sensors, as well to measure plant stress. But really the big ticket thing would be to tie everything together. I think the big challenge is when if you're a grower and you're having to look at like 9 different websites with pieces of information, that's really challenging. And sometimes those websites are giving you conflicting information. And just last week we had one recommendation for a 36-hour irrigation schedule, and another recommendation for 120 hours of irrigation. And that's it's a heck of a thing to try to figure out where exactly do you try to hit the sweet spot in the middle, or what do you do with that. So really bring everything together, kind of finding a platform to do that. That's something we're actually working on developing in-house currently is to try and to also automate some of our readings as well. One of the challenges we have is everybody has a way to measure water, measure how much water is going on. But if you're using multiple or one set of filters for multiple fields, it becomes challenging to be able to read those the meter readings of that. And so we're working with transducers there to try to kind of tie everything back and automate that process basically, instead of having people manually take readings. to automate that and really speed that process up as well, so we can see how much water we're using efficiently.
Well, for us, so I farm on the east side, so every time I hear these guys from the west side talk, I feel very fortunate because we don't have nearly as many challenges when it comes towards the salts and water, but we still are using a lot of technology. We're getting a little bit behind them, but we're starting to look at getting engaged on those water sensors. But if you look at, for us, and I would imagine most farmers, if you ask them what is the first major technology that they've been using, for us, every day I'm using something like Agrium, which is a way for us to help speed up what is our normal process for us in dealing with pesticide regulation, monitoring, and reporting. And that's something that I use every day, and it's changed how I do a lot of our pesticide use reporting in the sense that it just automates it. I can punch it in, it helps me verify that I'm doing everything correctly. When we talk about water sensors and whatnot, that's something that we're starting to get engaged in, and that is helping us become, because of all the droughts and new regulations, has driven us that route, because we've always done things very old school or old farm. But using those sensors, having that understanding of how it works, is we're still kind of getting up to speed. We're actually learning from these guys on the west side, kind of working out a lot of the problems.
So if I could summarize some of the comments then, it's looking to aggregate information, be it pesticide, irrigation, whatever, into a single platform that that's then actionable, I guess. And Danny, I think I heard you talk one time and you said you had 32 apps on your phone or something. Is that, am I misspeaking there?
2017, we tried a lot of different tools.
So that was close, right? So you can see where that might be a bit maddening, right? Trying to figure out when you have conflicting information between 36 hours and 100 hours or whatever that is, add them together, divide by 2 or something. I don't know. But yeah, so it sounds like there's some refinement that needs to be done, some checks and balances. That's why you want to probably have more one data point then. So something data's good, right?
Yeah.
And then put it on a single platform. So that's sort of the future then, as you guys see it's all converging out there in space, is uploading all the farm data into a single management system. Is that the holy grail, I guess? Is that?
I think it'd be very helpful. It's again, I don't think you can ever replace a farmer, and I hope you can, obviously, but for selfish reasons. But I certainly hope that you can find a way to simplify that decision making process. I think if you can if you put that information and lay it out there, it really helps drive that decision making process and speed it up a lot as well.
But it's important when you look at having that consolidated data, it needs to be something that the farmer working with a grower that can use. I mean, you can give him all this data, and it's so complicated, he can't really understand what's happening. It's useless. It has to be something that he can look at and equate to what they understand and what is relative to the natural process of agriculture. And that's one of the challenges I've seen with a lot of these sensors that we get, especially depending on which one you go to. You'll get a lot of data, and it requires a whole new set of learning just to interpret, so you can translate it into what you understand is happening out in the field.
Yeah, I think that what I'm hearing is something that we're dealing with on the farm right now, where we have 2 different ways of looking at the solutions that we're looking at. And I think for the next probably 3 years, a lot of what we're going to be looking at is like a dashboard related to reporting. So information, new information or existing information, and putting it in a way that's easy for people to understand and adopt into their existing behavior. But then on the other side, what we have is we're looking at the control center side, where we know that these people are using different thresholds or different types of elements to make their decisions, and we can probably automate some of those decisions. So there's the reporting side, and then there's the I want to watch things happen and be able to see them happen in a control center and adjust them happening. That's more the 5 to 7 year side of where we're at in our strategy. But for the next 3 to 5 years, it is, what information do we already have? How do we get it really organized and put it in a way that makes the grower more intelligent? Because that's what the information is trying to do, is trying to help us make better decisions. Beyond that, though, we are going to get to the point where I think the control side, where you have 2 or 3 sensors that are helping guide when that valve for that drip set turns on and off. I think that you're going to see that in the next 5 to 7 years, but it's going to it's going to be an interesting time period because there's still a lot of people that make decisions, and we need to help them as to adopt the technology and adopt the new information. We've got to use their decision now and how they're working now for the basis as we build towards the control center side.
So on just the dashboard you brought up. So do you envision it to have multiple dashboards where the irrigator on the quad has an iPad, and that gives them one level of understanding, and then somebody else another level, and then
I think
something
it
goes to the accountant, right?
Well, it forces us as growers to create an organizational chart and to create roles and permissions, because that can be built into the software so that the person that you want to just see irrigation data can just see irrigation data. And then the next level manager that maybe needs to see aggregated data from 10 different irrigators is going to see that. It's definitely on our farm forced us to take a really close look at our organizational chart and actually make one and really think intelligently about where we're putting employees, because that's going to be how we build our data architecture.
Okay, and then their relative responsibility to their job and stuff. So it's information appropriate, I guess, is the way to look at that, or data appropriate. Okay, good. And by the way, this is kind of an open session. So there's a question out there to follow on what you've heard. Now, Jose?
I have a question. You mentioned that on the website that you're managing also some issues with the purchase. Do you have, what type of sensors are you using? Are you measuring EC, are you adjusting for irrigation or pre-irrigation, or a combination of factors? So how are you doing?
So we're actually playing around with that really. I mean, this is the first year we're using that technology. So we're kind of looking at it from the standpoint of, okay, now we see what's out there. We see what what these EC values look like. Now, how can we help manage that? Is that instead of running a lot of short sets, do we run longer sets, potentially, fewer times per week, maybe push down those salts a little bit, or keep those salts suspended potentially? Really, it's just something we're kind of working through. It's first year, so we're kind of playing it by ear as we go.
And which sensors did you say you're using?
Actually, it's a Grow Guru sensors.
Raise your hand. Back to one of our startups. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my understanding that each sensor has its own reporting method, it's either via an app or some kind of interface. And so the issue is that there's nothing that aggregates all this information on a copacetic basis, so that you're comparing apples to apples, and then be able to do something with it. So you have to look at several different sources. You're getting the information is coming to you, but you have to interpret it from 20 different places, to not have one place where you can really look at it, and it's all a reasonable comparison. That's the issue.
Yeah, I think that there's irrigation solutions out there that are very close to doing that, especially if you're on a system that has reservoirs and wells, and you can turn things on and off whenever you want. I think there's systems that are very close to being able to do a lot of that interpretation for you to make the automation and scheduling easier. But I haven't seen anything that's 100% like perfect. But there's a lot of opportunity in that. But again, another challenge to that with relative to irrigation is that I can't turn my pump on whenever I want. I have an infrastructure piece ahead of me that delivers my water. So there's limits to what the technology can do too.
Unless it takes that into account, right?
Which means I then have to get into the canal company system, and they have to have a live canal. And we're going that direction, it's happening, but there's nothing that's marrying everything together. And I think a lot of that, it has to do with data and how we share data and how data is structured and standardized.
How much support do you have with your tech suppliers? Do they come out? Are they working closely with you? Are they partnering with you? Do they understand specifically your challenges that you have on the farms? I'm just curious, how much do you like to see from your supplier?
We had 40 in 2017, and I have 8 this year that I work regularly with. Because they're extremely supportive. I think that the support behind the tool is probably more important than the tool itself at this point.
And to piggyback on that comment, I think in a lot of senses, the more you can build it, or the more that you can sell, the more that you can ask as a company what a grower needs instead of trying to sell a product or trying to fit me into a box. That I think is the biggest the biggest thing you can sell is really that is some sort of malleability, because no grower, as you can tell, no grower does things the same, or maybe they do it 90% the same, but it's just not all the same. So really one of the keys is to have that flexibility and be able to develop something that's going to work for whether it's John, potentially flood irrigating something, or if you're on berry drip or something like that, you've got to have something that works with the multitude of systems as well. So, I'm not trying to pick on you.
Sure. Okay. All right. So currently looking right now, what are your pain points, and where would you like to see technology invested to help relieve those pain points?
I can say right now, the pain point for the industries that I work on a lot of the stone fruit industry and tree and other perishable crops and labor. And that's where we're looking for technology for the future, because it really doesn't exist yet to really help us with our labor. And I'm going to give you an example. Right now, just today, we're out picking peaches. It's all hand labor to pick fresh market peaches. It's all hand labor. And you pick the field several times, and the picker has to know what they're doing. California grows, I believe, I looked at it before I came here, about 562,000 tons of peaches. The next state is, I think, South Carolina. They do something like 60,000 tons. Georgia, which everyone thinks about peaches, is 43,000 tons. 562,000 tons of peaches are picked here in California. That's huge when they look at the state. Everyone thinks Georgia does a lot. We do a lot. If we can't solve our labor problem right now, that industry is looking at shrinking significantly, just because we cannot afford to maintain a hand labor market, be it a $15 wage, be it an 8-hour work week, be it whatever the case, shortage of water, all those things add into this threats to that industry. That's just one industry that we're looking at. And there are growers out there right now planting fields in a new way, hedgerowing them, because they are looking at that as a better way that a machine might be able to pick it, be it a robot, be it some other type of machine. So there's a desperation right now within that stone fruit industry to find a machine to pick, because they see on the horizon within a decade or so, we could almost see that industry disappear. That's just a snapshot of why labor, and that is the future for us. And when we look to tech, that's why we're pushing really hard. Hey, we need a machine to help us pick.
I'd say the same thing. Labor, water is obviously very important, but I think we're rapidly approaching a point where there's not any more to squeeze, at least on the west side. We are irrigating about as efficiently as you can. The plant's still going to need some amount of water. So labor is really, I think, the next big frontier. Whether it's using some sort of over-the-row irrigation for pre-irrigation on row crops, or some giant sprinkler setup where you don't have to move pipe. There's a lot of different options there, but the labor thing, that's going to be a huge killer in a lot of senses for a lot of folks over the next few years.
I think ours is labor related. We don't grow it, and we're growing more and more fresh crops that are hand harvested, so it's becoming a pinch point for us. But our issue, I think, right now is related to labor, and it's more competence related. I need people who know how to use Google Suite. I need people who are just competent on an iPhone, and I don't have to spend a whole lot of time training. So those are our big pain points, and so we're spending a lot of time educating the workforce, and it's kind of rewarding to an extent, because you're giving people an iPhone 8 that their last phone was a push phone, and you're getting to watch them kind of completely learn what their grandkid knows how to do. And we're actually getting stories about how grandpa's going home and he's learning how to use his iPhone from work from his grandkid. But that is our biggest challenge with the adoption of technology right now, is that we don't have a workforce that's fully competent in what we need. And I would say that goes all the way up. We had a pitch last week, and the solution said, hey, our farm manager spent 50 hours working last week and 30 of the hours were on the app. Well, our farm manager doesn't work like that at all right now. So there's a big competence change where I got to go from doing things one way to I got to do everything on the screen in a kind of structured way. On top of that, we've talked about disparate data sets and getting everything merged. I don't think that a solution is going to come do that. I think it's going to be a person on a farm who knows how to use plug and play type coding or different types of connections that exist for free. And they're going to be the ones that build the networks and the dashboards on the farms. So I think that at the highest level of the organizations too, there's a competence missing on farms. I think you need to have somebody that's a computer scientist or a data scientist that can help you connect those dots and display the data in an intelligent way.
So to summarize, it sounds like the entry level has gone up. Just showing up with strong back and a shovel isn't gonna get you through the day anymore. And my guess is you have fewer employees per acre, or how you calculate that value. And but they are more competent, more skilled, and higher and offer more value to the organization, all the way to the top. It sounds like. And that as we adopt the technology, the devil in detail is you better learn the technology, right? I understand that the technology changes. I'm afraid to put the apps on my phone because then I already learned what I like, right? And so the apps yeah, no more updates. So I'm on a need-to-know basis. So I probably wouldn't make it at Bowles. I don't know. Okay, great. Is there any questions from anybody about what you just heard? And so, yes, please.
I'm from Nebraska. I can give you an example. There's someone with 6,500 acres, mostly corn, soybean, and few dry beans and all that. He manages with 3 people and all vegetables. But what is typical in your area for that kind of acreage? How much labor you need?
Depends on the crop. Yeah, really. I mean, if you said how many acres?
6,500 and about 5,000 irrigated, the rest dry land.
So if you had all that on stone fruit, I think you'd probably need something like 5,000, 6,000 people. And that's a low number. I mean, probably is higher. Yeah. I mean, that's just some, but yeah. Well, it is. It isn't too. I mean, because if you look at a lot of that, your winter, spring, summer.
Yeah.
You get a couple months here and there.
Yeah. We have for the same ratio, we would have about 30 to 35 employees year round on our farm, and then we bring in as many. We'll have 1,000 people on the farm during periods of harvest, depending on which crops are going on at the same time.
So yeah, and like I said, we're probably somewhat similar to that. A lot of our labor is just in the irrigation, just checking tape and things like that. It's a lot less than it used to be. By far, we've made changes to kind of help, with the reduction in the labor force, there being fewer laborers and things like that. We've made a lot of changes, but I would say we'd probably, on 6,000, we'd probably be about 50 employees or something like that, probably, and then weeding crews and things like that here and there. But a lot of it comes down to how many irrigators do you need and things like that.
All right, so this is going to be a multiple choice. So I'm going to give you 5 areas. And so what issues keep you up at night? Just rank them in order. I think I know what the top 2 are, but labor, water supply quality, regulations, reporting, capital financing, or other. So if there's something I left out of the first 4, so that's labor, water, regulations, capital, other. You can't say all the above. That's what you can. Yeah, we like you to. Life's a lonely little thing here too.
Compliance, reporting, labor, water.
Oh, really? So the reporting stuff is made it to the top, huh?
As we grow more new crops, there's more new rules and new things that we need to be reporting.
Yeah, if you just stay in place, there's more new things you need to report too, right? Good.
For me, I look at it's kind of a horse race between labor and water. Which is if the water is in shorter supply that year, it might move to the top. But typically, standard labor has always been something that keeps me up at night. Then water, regulations, and then capital financing.
Labor, water, and regs.
Yeah, regs.
I think the regulatory piece actually ties pretty strongly into the labor and the water piece of it. So for me, I'd rank them probably water. Not quite as good a water district as Danny is, unfortunately. water regulatory, labor, and then capital, access capital.
And so obviously that's some of that's geographically driven and crop driven, which is driven to the geographic and resource driven stuff. But those three sort of sound like they all get your attention, right? Again, depending on the night and they keep you awake or not. Fair enough. Okay. Got about 10 minutes left. If anybody about the ranking of those or any questions in depth you might like to ask related to any of those? Okay.
How will that change with Sigma or water? What's the good side?
For me, water is at the top. It's yeah, Sigma's going to change things. We've kind of got a game plan based on what we think things are going to happen. But until the GSPs are released, you're kind of shooting in the dark a little bit. You think you know where things are going, but and you're trying to help shape that. There's at the end of the day, it's going to be what's required. Like I said, if we can have a little bit more reliability in our surface water supply, it would certainly make life on the west, at least on the westland side of things, a lot easier.
We're a good example that our basin's in balance, so we're all surface water deliveries. So it works. The surface water delivery thing really does work.
You got it. Right?
Yeah, Sigma, I think as Daniel has mentioned, it's kind of like worrying about a shadow right now. It really hasn't taken full form. I mean, we know it's going to have an impact. We just don't know how. And there's just a lot of discussion, at least where I am, where it's a lot more parties fighting over different portions of the basin, whether the basin's in balance. And that's pretty typical for a lot of different ag areas, as they're just not sure yet. But it will.
Okay, I got one question left for you guys, and this is put on your visionary hats. Looking out 5 to 10 years, as you integrate these technologies, precision ag, need for reporting, irrigation, trying to reduce labor and stuff, what does that system look like in your mind, ideally? How does it function, and how does it operate?
I'll go first. It's right here. I would say if you're a person with my role on the farm, I should in 5 to 10 years be able to sit here on my phone and not just see what's happening, but be able to control what's happening on the farm. And it should be intuitive enough that it's easy for me to do. In a matter of 2 or 3 clicks, I should be able to get in and see field level information if I want to go see a specific operation. And I think that one of the things that is going to change a lot, especially when you look at how we manage farms and farm processes right now, is we're going to get away from files and folders, and we're going to get very query based, meaning that you're going to start typing what it is that you're looking for or saying what you're looking for, and it's going to populate the information you're looking for versus following a path to go find that specific file in a folder. So that's going to mean that we have to change how our brains work quite a bit, but a person that's in my role on a farm in 5 to 10 years should be able to do everything from their mobile phone. That's my vision for the future.
Okay.
I'm on a similar track. I think I think a lot of things be app based. That's kind of the. I mean, if you have to log onto your computer to look it up, you're probably not going to do it at some point. So I think we can come back to your phone or an app, just be able to click, zoom in. Maybe have a potential diagnosis if you see a problem. Be able to zoom in on that problem. Have that computer be able to look over the historicals for the farm if there's historical, flight. I'm drawing on the word, but when they do the flyovers and they take the photos, if you were to be able to look at what those stressors look like and have that be able to go back in history and look and say, hey, we've got a mite problem potentially developing on one corner of the ranch based on 10 years of previous photography. Something like that, I think would be you should go check that out. Again, like I said, I don't think you'll ever eliminate the farm or the farmer, I should say, from the farm. But you're going to help him be able to pinpoint the issues and be able to treat those issues a lot more quickly. That would be my guesstimation.
The same. I mean, what they said is absolutely true. It's really looking at the technology to help us in the future. It would help us be better farmers by bringing together all that information, putting it at our fingertips, and allowing us the ability to make decisions with the best available data and be able to react to those in a timely manner. And that's really when you're a farmer out there. I think my grandfather always used to say the best fertilizer was on footprints in the field. And this is just helping us get so many more footprints out in that field, digitally as well as physically. And having it on your phone, you can be out there, you can look at it, you can make decisions and react to them immediately. That just helps us be better farmers, be more efficient with the resources that we have, and produce more crops with less drops, as the phrase goes. But also, if it comes down to labor or any other technology, bringing all that together so that we are more efficient to be better at what we do.
And we haven't really touched on drones and plane and satellite stuff. So remote sensing, I'd like to just, where are you using, any of you using drones now, information, plane-based satellite, and then do you look to increase that data? So, Danny?
We're using satellite data operationally, meaning that we're making operational decisions at scale with satellite data, and we are now incorporating hyperspectral imagery from an airplane into that satellite imagery. Drones we're using, but until the FAA changes line of sight regulations, they aren't scalable. So we're just learning what they're going to be capable of doing, but it's not scalable right now.
Yeah, we're similar in the sense that we're having things flown over, satellite imaging taking place. A lot of times there's some lag in the satellite data, and so that's challenging if you're using it, depending on what kind of decisions you're trying to make based on that. But yeah, the drone thing it's actually helping when you're farming thousands of acres. You can only have so many boots in the field and so many folks that know what to look for in the field. So being able to get in the air, be able to look right in the middle of that block, just kind of having those eyes above is helpful.
For us, we're really not using a lot of drones. We do mostly tree crops, and we found that there's been limited value to drones on that, being able to penetrate that canopy and really see what's going on. So we haven't really engaged in that as much. We're hopeful of one day we'll find some nexus.
So the regulatory gap with drones, as I understand, something from wrong with getting, but line of sight means you have to have a pilot there, and even though it's all pre-programmed, don't need anything, it's just that person has to go put it in the dirt if it gets out of control. Is that kind of what it's about?
I mean, all you're gonna do is hit the home button.
Yeah. So
I feel like that's pretty easy to automate.
Yeah. So there's not enough trust, I guess, by our government to allow these drones to fly around unsupervised.
Well, it makes sense maybe where we're sitting here today, but where our farm is, we're 7-8 miles from the nearest municipal airport. There needs to be some exemptions or waivers. A process needs to be developed.
Sure. To really fully adapt the technology. I think we're at the witching hour. I want to thank you all. Can we give a nice round of applause? I think there are great cross sections of the valley here: east side, west side, north, south, good water, not so good water, lots of water, not so lots of water. All the things that are the challenge in the valley, and so I'm always amazed people think that the valley is this standardized farming region, and I say, thank you for all you do. I really do appreciate you. You got great value to what we do here. So thank you.